Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and basically, I'm not watching the fight right now, and shit like that, because I'm basically need to do my videos, so I'm not watching any of the fights right now. I seen the prelims though, and I seen Brandon Figueroa have that very controversial decision against Joet Gonzalez, but we're gonna get to that later on, and shit like that. So, first we're gonna go with well, it's not Fierro. He isn't fighting Fierro anymore. I don't know what happened with Fierro, but he's fighting Omar Salcedo. So I'm sorry if this doesn't show Salcedo, and shit like that. But but basically that's the thing and stuff like that. And stuff. I'll have it as like the as I'll have a thumbnail, to show Pitbull versus Omar Salcedo. But basically in the fight, I would say I'm gonna have this short. The early rounds, I would say that Isak is gonna win. Probably. I would say all of the early rounds. I would probably say the mid rounds is gonna be more competitive. I would say. I would say that it's gonna be in favor. I would say that it will be evened up. You know, like either way I see it being even, and shit like that towards the mid of the fight. But then after that, and stuff like that, the later of the fight, and stuff like that, I see Isak Cruz winning the fight. And honestly, he could honestly stop Salcedo. Salcedo, like, overall, like, he did beat Chris Colbert. I didn't really see fully of what happened. Honestly, I barely even seen any footage of Salcedo. So I'm just saying, like, everything of what I'm saying, don't take it to heart, and shit like that. But I'm just gonna be assuming of what he does, and shit like that. Where he also is kind of like Isak, where he's like an aggressive power puncher, and shit like that, But either way, I just feel like that Isak, if I would say a stoppage or a decision, I feel like Isak is gonna find a way to get a stoppage, and stuff like that, because Salcedo, he's good, but it's just like, he beat Chris Colbert, yes, but it just like, like I feel like Isak, it's like he's gonna show people that he's in the high, he's in that high level, and shit like that, and he's nobody to mess around with, and shit like that, So I would say a late round stoppage for Isak Cruz against Omar Salcedo. And yeah, and shit like that, but yeah, and shit like that, actually not a thumbnail. I'm actually actually I'm just keep it like this. I'm gonna just keep the thumbnail like this, cuz I don't think it really matters, and stuff like that, But then next we got who do we? Oh yeah, we got Tim Tszyu versus or Sebastian Fundora versus Tim Tszyu, the rematch. But be right back, y'all.
Huh?
Oh no, because hold up. But next is Fundora versus Tszyu 2. So basically in this fight, this is gonna be a good fight. This one I'm gonna talk more about a little bit more because I wanted to get the pit bull fight out the way. But but basically with Fundora versus Tszyu, basically who I like how I like what these fighters need to do. I just feel like honestly these fighters need to do the same thing. It's just more of a just who will be able to land the more significant shots. You know what I'm saying? Because it's just both fighters did exactly what they needed to do. And, it's just more of that Fundora just had the better of Tszyu. You know what I mean? But it was a really good fight, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? But that's the thing and shit like that. And overall, I do feel like that the second fight is going to be very similar to the first fight, and shit like that, Maybe a little bit of changes because I don't think both of these fighters are going to want to get hit like that, like how they did the first fight. So I feel like, that, that Zoo, he's gonna more think more and try to like, counter his way into the fight, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, but at the end of the day and shit like that, it will end up into a brawl, and shit like that, it's just like, but it'll be more patient, and shit like that. It wouldn't just be right off the bat they're both just throwing bombs, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And yeah, and shit like that, but yeah, so that's what both the fighters need to do to winning, and shit like that. It's basically the same thing of what they did last time. Zoo, getting into the inside of Fedora, brawling his way inside, and shit like that, throwing the more significant shots, and stuff like that. Fedora making sure he keeps Tim Zoo at range and shit like that, so then he doesn't, get in the inside at all, and shit like that, So basically, it's just more of like, that's what both of these fighters need to do, and shit like that, and yeah, and shit, because it's like, yeah, but hold up. But yeah, but this is who I think is gonna win this fight, and shit like that, is that the early rounds of the fight, I do see the early rounds being, I see it being in favor of, I would say, Sebastian Fedora, and shit like that. Or it depends of how you look at it. If Tim Zoo's more aggressive, and stuff like that, then like you could probably just sneak the rounds to Tim Zoo. But I'm gonna give it to Fedora. And that's the thing and shit like that, so like, and hold up. And basically, like the early rounds, I would say is gonna be in favor. I would actually say it's gonna be a tie, between Fedora and Zoo. And then I would say that the mid rounds is gonna be in favor of. I would say the mid rounds is gonna be in favor of Tim Zoo, and stuff like that. I do see this fight being definitely like more competitive in Tim Zoo's favor, and shit like that, But but I do see Tim Zoo winning the mid rounds, and stuff like that, But then after that, I see Sebastian Fedora winning the later rounds, and shit like that, But overall, I would in a close fight, and stuff like that, I still see Sebastian still edging the fight, and shit like that, I just feel like it's just more because I just feel like because Sebastian is a tall motherfucker for that division. He's is taller than a lot of heavyweights. He's 6 foot, like what, 6'7", Sebastian Fedora. That's the thing. Tim Zoo is only 5'10", which I mean he's a big welterweight. Super welterweight. He's a regular size welterweight. Super welterweight, but it's just more of like Sebastian Fedora is like a weight bully, you know what I'm saying? And it's just, and it's just like everything is gonna be with power. It's just like Sebastian, the first fight was just dictating the first fight with the jab. He could still find his ways into going back into dictating the fight to a jab again, and then just throwing his punches from the outside, either way, because he has to fight from the outside. Because whenever he's fighting in the inside, every single time Tim Zoo was winning that exchange, and shit like that, But Tim Zoo was like, eventually, there was more of a lot of moments where Tim Zoo had to just throw his punches, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? There was a lot of moments where Tim Zoo just had to throw his punches, and from the outside and not the inside, and shit like that, because he literally couldn't get into the inside, or it would cost him even getting knocked out, and shit like that, or it just, his punches didn't feel very good. So yeah, and shit like that, either way, whatever could happen is whatever can happen, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? But I do feel like that Fedora did enough in the last fight and shit like that. Where, he still showed people that or in the last fight against Tenzu, he still showed that he's that guy, and shit like that, and, he knows what to do to beat Tenzu. Even when he really has to fight, he knows what he needs to do to beat Tenzu. Because it's just, because I'm just saying, and shit like that. But both of these fighters have the same amount of ability to beating each other, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, So, yeah, and shit like that, But either way and shit like that, like, if, like, I want to pick somebody to win this fight and not a draw. Because it could be a draw, but I'm not going to say a draw, and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, But, yeah, and shit. But I do see Sebastian Fundora winning this fight by a close decision, in a really... in overall a big time brawl, and shit like that, But I see Sebastian Fundora, still edging this fight, and shit like that, But yeah, and shit like that, But the main event, Manny Pac-Man Pacquiao versus Mario Barrios. Yeah, man, and shit like that. Manny Pacquiao, like, how many fights have I done for, like, honestly, I only done, like, one fight of Manny Pacquiao, and shit like that. Like, I only done, like, one fight of Manny Pacquiao, and that was when he fought, or no, actually, I don't even think I did any fights of Manny Pacquiao yet, and shit like that. This is, like, the first fight that I'm actually promoting Manny Pacquiao's fight, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? So, this is the first fight, and shit, but I've seen a bunch of Manny Pacquiao fights, and shit like that, but yeah, and shit like that, but basically, this is gonna be a very, like, a good fight, because Manny Pacquiao is Manny Pacquiao. We know what he can do, what he can bring to the table. Obviously, his last fight, what retired him was the heartbreaking loss against what was his name and stuff like that, was against Yordenis Ugas, and shit like that, and that loss was heartbreaking, and shit like that against Yordenis Ugas, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? It was definitely very heartbreaking, and shit like that, because going into the fight, most people had Manny Pacquiao winning that fight, and shit like that, which, I mean, and I was included into that. I thought Manny Pacquiao would have won that fight, but it just, like, and he was doing good early on until it's just like, until Ugas, just showed him that, that this is the, like, even though, like, Ugas isn't, like, he's also older too, you know what I'm saying? Like, he's also older too, but he hasn't been fighting as long as Pacquiao. But that's the thing and shit like that, but I really do feel like that fight was kind of a tailor-made fight for Yordenis Ugas. And I always said that, and shit like that, like, I always said that, with Pacquiao versus Yordenis Ugas, I always, like, after that fight, after Pacquiao lost that fight, I honestly was saying, like, I honestly feel like Pacquiao is tailor-made for Yordenis Ugas, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm not lying, like, I remember me saying that shit, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit, because Ugas, like, is like a different style of fighter of what Manny's used to. Manny's more used to fighters that like the pressure fight and brawl, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing and shit like that, But Yordenis Ugas is more of like a clinical boxer. Like he he likes to be rangy, counter, and stuff like that, and overall, and with Ugas, he's very quick with that, and Ugas is it's honestly a pretty big welterweight, in my opinion, and shit like that. I always felt like he was kind of a big welterweight, and then he went to 154, and shit like that, But that's the thing, So he was a lot bigger than Manny Pacquiao, and so it's like it was a lot more easier for him to pick his shots and shit against Manny Pacquiao because he was more bigger, and stuff like that. But yeah, but anyways, I'm gonna go into my into what these fighters need to do to winning this fight. What Pacquiao needs to do to winning this fight is that Manny Pacquiao needs to, like, he needs to, like, kind of, think, like, he needs to think a little bit more because he always thinks when he fights. But I feel like when he fought Yordenis Ugas, he wasn't thinking at all when he was fighting him. He just thought that, oh, I'm Manny Pacquiao, that's Yordenis Ugas. I have all this, like, I could beat him, and stuff like that, but it didn't turn out in that favor. He needs to actually, like, be more, be more wise where he's throwing, and, and that's the thing and shit like that, Like, what, basically when he fought Keith Thurman, and shit like that, like, he needs to, fight like how he fought Keith Thurman, and shit like that, because that's the thing and shit like that, because it's like, because, because, like, when he fought Keith Thurman was moving around a lot, was cutting the angles, everything and shit like that, but that didn't take away from Manny Pacquiao to throwing his punches. Like from throwing his punches, and stuff like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, and basically, that's the thing and shit like that, So it's like he needs to do that, and shit like that, like because I do. But the thing is with Ugas, he's like I wouldn't say he's more craftier than Keith Thurman with his footwork. Because I feel like they're both the same with their footwork, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, that's the thing and shit like that. Like, they're both the same with their footwork, and shit like that, So it's like, he just needs to have more heart in this fight. In this fight. Overall, like, I feel like this fight should be more easier than when he fought Keith Thurman or when he fought Yordenis Ugas. Well, I don't know about Ugas. See, like, well, yeah, stylistically, yeah, because I know Barrios beat Ugas, but, but overall, Ugas's chin is pretty suspect. Mom, you could go through here. You could go through here.
Oh, while you were doing a video.
Oh, no, it's okay. But yeah, because Ugas's, power and shit, like, or his chin is suspect. Barrios got power, and shit like that. I know he only got 11 knockouts, blah, 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 but don't underestimate his power. He's known for his power, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And that's what beat Ugas, because it's just, because Ugas has to be able to be in his own distance and be able to throw his own punches and even have punches be landed on himself. But Barrios and shit like that, it's like, he's a type where it's like you can't have that many punches landed on you, and shit like that, and stuff like that, unless if you just want to get hurt all day long, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And that's the thing and shit like that, but so yeah, but either way, it's just stylistically this is more tougher because it's just more of like Barrios is definitely more of a patient puncher, and shit like that, and but at the same time, it's still, I don't know, because Barrios still shows that he still can move his feet and can still utilize range and counter punch and, and punch at, like, from far range and move his feet, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? So it could catch Pacquiao off of hinge, and shit like that, and that's the thing, and shit like that. So that's the thing, man, so I'm just saying, and shit like that. And obviously with Barrios, he had that fight with Keith Thurman, and shit like that, and he lost that fight, and stuff like that. Keith Thurman outclassed him. But in that fight against Abel Ramos, I feel like, that fight should, like, I feel like that fight was rightly so a draw, and shit like that, because both fighters did evenly, like, it was obviously a draw in that fight. But it's just at the same time, it's just if somebody would have won the fight, I would have said that Abel Ramos would have won that fight, and shit like that. I feel like that he did more damage of what he did than Barrios, but overall that Barrios is the champion. So I mean they both knocked each other down and shit like that. So it is more fair, but but Abel Ramos was hurting Barrios a lot more. Was hurting Barrios more than Abel Ramos was getting hurt, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? But basically, with Mario Barrios, what he needs to do to winning this fight is that he needs to be able to utilize his distance. Do exactly what Yordenis Ugas did. Counterpunch. Utilize your distance. Keep on moving around. You know what I'm saying? And shit like that. You know what I mean? And shit. Do what Yordenis Ugas did and move your feet. Cut the angles off. And shit like that. Know what angles is gonna make it difficult for Pacquiao and throw Pacquiao off of his rhythm. And shit like that. And that's the thing and shit like that, because Pacquiao, like, he's almost 50 years old, and shit like that. So Barrios can do that, you know what I'm saying? And that's the thing and shit like that, But the one thing with Pacquiao, to go back to Pacquiao, is that body is wide open for Pacquiao, and Pacquiao loves eating that body up, and shit like that, and shit with punches, and shit like that, and that's the thing. And overall, like, that's gonna make Mario Barrios to clinch, and shit like that. That's when Pacquiao can start throwing his punches, but Barrios could still move and can still cut the angles off of Pacquiao. You know what I mean? But this is how I see the fight. The early rounds, and shit like that of the fight, I see, honestly, I see the early rounds being in favor of Mario Barrios, and shit like that, to be honest with you. Because it's like, because at the same time, it's like, because Barrios is going to make the angles tough for Pacquiao. You know what I mean? So I do see the early round being in favor of Barrios. I see the mid rounds being even, and shit like that, But, oh, man, dude. And stuff like that. I don't know, man. And shit like that. I really don't know. And stuff like that. With the later rounds, I would say that the later rounds is going to be even of a tie, and shit like that, 2-2, and shit like that, So, in that case, the scenario, it would be, so 3-1, and then, 2-2, and then, 1, and then 1-2. Overall, man, and shit like that, it's like, I'm not gonna lie, dude. It's like, it's kind of different, man. Like, this is like, if Pacquiao gets into the fight like how he did against Keith Thurman, and shit like that, he should be able to win this fight. You know what I mean? And shit like that. Like, he should be able to win this fight if he goes into the fight like how he fought Keith Thurman. And shit like that, But it just, in that fight against Yordenis Ugas and shit like that, like, when he fought Keith Thurman, he was still, actively training and was still, basically, was still basically as a fighter, and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, he was still as a fighter, and shit. And hi Isaiah. Hey. But what was I saying and shit, but basically that's the thing and shit like that, so it's like, if he fights how he did against Keith Thurman, he could win this fight, bro. He could most definitely win this fight. But I feel like that the layoff, and shit like that with Yordenis Ugas, like, he had the same layoff right now, and shit like that from last time when he fought Yordenis Ugas. So it's like, it's just like, unless if he just magically knows how everything is and shit like that, like, he could know, man. Pacquiao most definitely can know, you know, and shit like that, you know, like, he can know, bro, you know, and shit like that. He most definitely can know. But, man, dude, you know, and shit like that, you know, it's just like, that fight against Yordenis Ugas was kind of questionable, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? It's like, you know, because it's like, and he had that layoff. Barrios beat Yordenis Ugas, and that's the thing and shit like that, you know, and overall he carries more power than Yordenis Ugas, you know, and stuff like that, you know, and Pacquiao was still getting bothered by those punches from Yordenis Ugas, you know, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? So, like, that's the thing and shit like that, you know, so, oof, man, dude. At the same time, though, and shit like that, I'm gonna be a little biased on this, you know, and shit like that. I'm not, like, it just, I can't go against Pacquiao, you know, and shit like that, you know, just, Pacquiao's Pacquiao, you know, and shit like that, you know, so it's like, he should win this fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, but it just, at the same time, from my actual prediction, from who I actually really will, who I think is actually gonna win round by round, I think Mario Barrios is gonna take it, man. You know, and shit like that. You know, I want Pacquiao to win. You know, and shit like that. You know, but you know, it just like, I just feel like that Barrios is gonna know what he needs to do. You know, and shit like that. You know, to defeating the older man of Manny Pacquiao, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean, you know, and stuff like that, you know, but it's just more of like, I don't know, because, and shit like that, you know, but if I had to be,
take out the tent too?
hold on, guys, hold up,
Oh, sorry.
but basically, if Pacquiao can show me that he can be able to actually, like, you know, do what he needs to do and shit like that, you know, and if he wins this fight, you know, and shit like that, in a war, like, even in a war, you know, and shit like that, if he wins this fight, I'm gonna give him his respect again. But it's just like, you know, it's just like, you know, I just don't know, because it just, that fight again, like, at the same time, every fight is different, you know what I mean, you know, and shit like that, but Pacquiao was really trying against Yordenis Ugas, you know, and shit like that, like, he was really trying, you know, and shit like that, you know, but, and that's the thing and shit like that, you know, but it's just like, Barrios, he's gonna do what he needs to do to making things difficult for Pacquiao, you know, and stuff like that, you know, so, that's the thing, man, you know, and shit like that, you know, so, if I had, like, overall and shit like that, like, if I'm, if I'm betting on somebody, I'm betting on Pacquiao, you know, because, I mean, I'll do a risk for reward and shit like that, you know, for Pacquiao, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean, and that's the thing and shit like that, you know, but, at the same time, though, I'm gonna just say it like this, the better man heading into the fight, you know, and stuff like that, you know, like, I would say that the boogeyman heading into this fight is Mario Barrios, you know, and shit like that, you know, I feel like it's not Pacquiao, that's gonna be the boogeyman in this fight, you know, it's gonna be Mario Barrios, because if Pacquiao just continuously just tries to just fight and just throw his punches without, like, really, like, doing anything to showing any respect to Barrios is just gonna make him, like, have respect, even just drop him, possibly even knock out Pacquiao, you never even know, you know, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying, so, that's the thing and shit like that, you know, so, overall, my final prediction is that I would say that heading into this fight, you know, and stuff like that, you know, Pacquiao can still change my mind, you know, but heading into this fight, I'm gonna roll with Mario Barrios, you know, and shit like that, you know, because it's just like, Barrios is a good fighter, you know, and shit like that. I know he's like a fringe champion, you know, and shit like that, kind of like, you know, like a champion that's like, you know, that can get beat anytime, but it's just like, this is definitely stylistically more of an even match, because Pacquiao is almost 50, he's 47 years old, and that's the thing and shit like that, you know, So yeah, you know, and shit like that. So that's my final prediction. I got Mario Barrios, you know, by, I would say, a close decision. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Please, for the new people, like getting like that's you know that's watching my channel, like please, you know, like subscribe, because I'm really trying to get to 100 subscribers, you know, and shit like that, you know, and that would just mean a lot, man, you know, and shit like that, you know, that would mean a lot, you know, and I'm really trying to get there, you know, like, you know, we're almost there. I'm at 60, I think 62 subscribers, but I'm almost there to 100, you know, so I'm almost there, man, you know, so yeah, you know, but thank y'all for watching this video, and yeah, peace.